It was a late Thursday afternoon when the clouds began gathering low above the city skyline, casting elongated shadows over the streets and filling the air with that heavy stillness that often arrives just before a storm. The grocery store sat quietly at the corner of a narrow intersection, its sun-faded awning fluttering slightly in the breeze. It wasn't much to look at: chipped red bricks, a rusting cooler humming outside, and a flickering sign that had once proudly displayed the name Mendoza's Market, now dulled by years of wear. Inside, Luis, the store's owner for nearly 3 decades, was rearranging the produce crates with the same practiced motions he had carried out nearly every day since his father passed the store down to him. At 62, his back bent more easily, his steps had slowed, and the spark in his eyes dimmed a little more each year. But the store remained his anchor, the place he had worked his entire adult life, the place where he believed everything made sense. He never imagined that on that ordinary afternoon, everything he thought he knew would shatter with the sound of a soft thud just outside his door. Luis heard it just as he was lifting a box of oranges. Not the bang of a car or the clatter of a crate, but something smaller, almost indistinct, a kind of weight hitting the pavement softly, like someone letting go too slowly. He peeked past the dusty front window and saw the figure lying still at the base of the doorframe. It was a dog, old, frail, matted in patches, with a coat more gray than its original brown. Its ribcage was clearly outlined beneath its sagging skin, and its legs folded under it like they had simply given up. The scene struck Luis with an eerie familiarity, though he couldn't explain why. He rushed outside, kneeling beside the animal, his hands hovering, unsure of how to help. The dog was breathing, but barely. Its chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms, and its head lolled to the side as Luis whispered something. He didn't even know what, into the wind. He wasn't used to moments like this. He dealt in bananas and beans, not broken lives and dying animals. Yet something about this dog felt deliberate, like it hadn't just collapsed, but had chosen that precise spot, that precise moment. As Luis leaned closer, he noticed something odd around the dog's neck. Not a collar in the usual sense, but a piece of weathered cloth tied like a bandana, damp with sweat and dirt. Tucked tightly into the folds was a small plastic pouch, the kind used to store notes or documents when one expected exposure to the elements. It was knotted tightly, as if it had been prepared with care and forethought. Luis hesitated only for a moment before untying it. The dog didn't move. With careful fingers, he peeled open the pouch and slid out a single folded piece of paper, slightly wrinkled but intact. The edges were smudged, the ink faded in places, but the writing was legible. What he read made his entire body tense, as if someone had poured cold water down his spine. He read it once, then again. Each word struck deeper, opening something buried inside him, a memory, a name, a silence he had learned to live with for decades. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply stood there, still holding the letter, as if paralyzed by its weight. His knees nearly buckled, and for the first time in years, he dropped the oranges still in his other hand. Customers inside heard the crash but saw only the back of their shopkeeper frozen on the sidewalk, a dog at his feet and a letter in his hand. Luis couldn't explain the feeling rushing through him. It wasn't just grief. It was recognition. A story he thought had ended long ago was suddenly breathing again, lying wounded in front of him in the form of a dying animal and a message that refused to fade with time. The dog stirred slightly, one paw twitching weakly. Luis blinked as if waking from a trance, gathered the limp body in his arms, and brought it inside the store. He cleared a space behind the counter, laying the dog gently on a pile of burlap sacks. The animal's eyes fluttered open briefly and met his, tired, distant, but aware. Luis sat beside him, the letter still in hand, and let the memories he had locked away for years come flooding back. He hadn't heard that name in over 20 years. And now it was written on paper, tied to the neck of a dying dog, as if time had looped in on itself and delivered the past right to his door. Outside, the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall. The letter trembled slightly in his grip, and Luis, for the first time in a long while, did not move to close the door or protect the merchandise from the weather. He simply stared at the dog, whose breathing now seemed to slow even further, and whispered under his breath a name he thought he had forgotten. A name the letter had brought back with full force. The same name that had once meant family, pain, and an unfinished story left to rot in the back of his memory. Luis had never been a man to believe in signs. Life for him had always been linear, practical, a path paved by routine and repetition. But that night, after the dog collapsed and he read the letter, nothing about the world felt predictable anymore. The sky outside had turned an ashen gray, and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the store's front windows only made the silence inside more pronounced. The store was closed earlier than usual. The Abierto sign remained faintly lit, but Luis didn't flip it over. He wasn't thinking about customers or restocking or what bills were due at the end of the month. His thoughts circled a name that echoed from the past, etched in his memory, and now resurrected by the crumpled paper he had folded and tucked into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The old dog, whose breathing had grown shallower, lay still behind the counter, his side rising and falling like a tired tide on a dying shore. Luis had spent the last 2 hours barely moving, sitting on a wooden stool a few feet away, arms resting on his knees, eyes lost in a space between the present and some forgotten corner of memory. The dog had not made a sound, not a single whimper or growl, as if he, too, had fulfilled a mission and now waited for permission to let go. What haunted Luis more than the animal's condition was the letter itself. The unmistakable handwriting, the slant of each word, the way certain letters curled in the same distinct manner. It couldn't have been forged. No one else knew how to form the letter R that way, nor would anyone have written with that specific blend of urgency and regret. It wasn't a coincidence. It was real. And it came from the same hand that had once written Luis a goodbye he never recovered from. That letter, carried in the collar of a dog that looked like it had wandered through years of pain and solitude, had been addressed to Luis by name. Not "Dear Sir," or "To whom it may concern," but Luis Mendoza, in a trembling but deliberate penmanship. The first line was direct and disarming. "If this dog reaches you, it means I am gone." Luis had read that line over and over again, unable to accept its finality. The rest of the letter spoke of a debt, not of money, but of truth. It spoke of a child never introduced, of a mistake never corrected, of a silence that should never have lasted so long. The writer had lived close, within the city limits, always intending to reach out but never finding the courage until time ran out. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness, it begged for understanding. It named the dog, said he had been the writer's only companion in the last years of their life, and pleaded with Luis to take care of him, to keep alive a fragment of what had once been severed. Luis had read it again in the darkened back room, while the thunder rolled faintly overhead. He hadn't cried. The tears didn't come, not because he wasn't moved, but because his grief was older than his sadness. It had fermented into something dense, something that lived in his bones. This wasn't the kind of pain that poured out easily. It settled into the body like weight after years of carrying loss in silence. He looked at the dog again, its eyes now closed, its breath thinner. He knelt beside it once more and placed a thick wool blanket over its frail frame. He adjusted the dog's head gently, not knowing whether it was comforting the animal or himself. The letter had said the dog was called Tobias. A name simple and soft, perhaps chosen in a moment of warmth during years filled with cold. He watched the dog twitch faintly and then become still again. Luis stood slowly and walked to the door of the store. Rain still drizzled outside, softening the sounds of the street, and the glow of the overhead lamp flickered against the window. He locked the door from the inside, pulled down the shutter halfway, and returned to the back room where Tobias lay. He couldn't explain why, but something about the entire day felt sacred, as if life had handed him a chance to close a circle that had remained painfully open for too long. In the solitude of the store, among the shelves of rice, canned beans, and dusty cereal boxes, a dying dog was rewriting the ending of a story that never got the closure it deserved. Luis didn't sleep that night. He stayed by Tobias, offering small sips of water, warming rice in a pan just to see if the dog would eat, even though he knew he wouldn't. The animal was done. But it wasn't death that haunted Luis, it was the knowledge that the dog had come this far, carrying a message no one else could have delivered. That devotion, that silent mission, had bridged a chasm Luis thought unbridgeable. The dog had been trained, perhaps even begged, to find him. Or maybe it had simply remembered a face, a scent, a story told so many times it embedded itself in the animal's instincts. Either way, Tobias had found him, and that mattered more than anything Luis had known in years. As the early light crept across the tiled floor and the shadows of fruit crates stretched longer than usual, Luis sat in silence, watching the rise and fall of a body that had carried too much. He whispered his thanks, barely audible, as if afraid the words would fracture the delicate peace that had settled in the store. For the first time in decades, he felt seen, acknowledged by a past he thought had condemned him to a lifetime of regret. And it came not in the form of a phone call or a reunion, but in the silent collapse of a dog at his door, carrying a truth wrapped in paper and tied in a collar. When the morning light pushed through the thin curtains of the store's back room, it found Luis still seated near the old dog, whose breathing had grown shallow and irregular. The air was colder now, filled with the scent of damp cardboard and ground coffee, and Luis hadn't moved from his position for hours. Tobias, the dog who had arrived like a ghost from the past, had spent the night fading slowly, wrapped in silence and warmth. Luis had done all he could, small sips of water pressed to his cracked lips, a piece of chicken torn into soft shreds, even a flannel cloth warmed over the stove and laid across the dog's spine. But none of it was about saving him anymore. It was about honoring him, witnessing the final moments of a journey that had already crossed oceans of time and sorrow. Luis stood at last, his knees stiff, his body heavy from the weight of memories. He looked out through the storefront's half-raised shutter. The street was beginning to stir, an old woman pulling a cart of flowers, a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of his bakery, two teenagers with backpacks waiting for the bus. It was an ordinary day in the eyes of everyone outside, but for Luis, everything had shifted. He hadn't told anyone yet. He hadn't called for help or explained to any neighbor why the store had stayed closed, why the man who never took breaks was nowhere to be found during his usual hours. Some part of him didn't want to share this yet. It was still sacred, still his alone. This encounter, this message carried in fur and pain and years of absence, needed time to settle inside him before it could be spoken aloud. He sat once more beside Tobias, whose eyes were half closed now, gaze fixed on nothing. Luis brushed his hand gently along the dog's side, feeling the fragile frame beneath the thinning fur. He remembered a night many years ago, on a bench in a park not far from where he now sat, when someone had told him they were leaving. No arguments, no screams, just quiet disappointment and the slow closing of a door he thought would remain open forever. She had cried, not out of rage but resignation. Luis hadn't followed her. He thought pride mattered more. He thought time would bring her back. But time had passed, relentlessly, and silence became their new language. That night, as she walked away, he had watched her disappear into the fog, and never saw her again. Now, decades later, the dog she had loved, the dog she had raised alone in the aftermath of their separation, had found him. He opened the letter again, smoothing the worn edges, and reread the final lines. "I'm sorry I never sent you pictures. I'm sorry I never introduced you to the one who kept me going. This dog knows the smell of grief. He carried mine. Now he carries the rest to you." There were no instructions, no dramatic revelations, only a quiet request for closure. And somehow, that made it more powerful. Tobias had been her last act of connection, the vessel of a goodbye that never made it on time, the bridge between a love once full of plans and the years of absence that had followed. Luis folded the letter with care, and placed it in a drawer beneath the counter. He retrieved a small blanket, one that had once covered crates of oranges in winter, and carefully wrapped Tobias's body. The dog hadn't moved in the last hour. His chest barely rose anymore. Luis understood what was happening. He knew the final breath would come soon, and when it did, he wanted to be holding him. He lifted the bundle gently and placed it in a large fruit box, cushioned with old towels and layers of soft packaging. Then he sat once more, close enough to feel the warmth fading slowly from the creature who had walked through unknown distances just to complete one final task. The hours passed in silence. Customers knocked and left. The city moved around him, unaware of the sacred stillness inside the grocery store. By midday, Tobias exhaled one last shallow breath, and then his body stilled. Luis did not cry. Instead, He bowed his head and placed a hand over the dog's paw, offering a silent thank you. This animal, old and broken, had done more for him in 2 days than most humans had in a lifetime. He had carried a legacy, not of wealth or status, but of emotion, of unfinished bonds, of words never spoken. In doing so, he had allowed Luis to feel again, to open a room inside himself that had remained locked in dust and shadows. By evening, Luis had closed the store completely. He placed a note on the door, scribbled in rushed handwriting, Cerrado por razones personales. Gracias por su comprensión. Then he took the box containing Tobias and walked quietly toward the edge of town. He passed buildings he had known for years, alleys he had once run through as a boy, and corners where laughter had once echoed. Now, they were all silent witnesses to his quiet pilgrimage. At the small plot of land behind the old chapel, a place where forgotten pets and lost causes often found rest, Luis knelt and dug with his bare hands. No shovel. No ceremony. Just hands in the soil, pulling rocks, shifting roots, creating space for something that had carried so much. He buried Tobias beneath a tree with leaves that shook gently in the wind. He marked the grave with a small wooden crate, upturned, and carved the name with a pocketknife, Tobias, faithful to the very end. Then he sat beside the mound of fresh earth, legs folded, dirt under his nails, the smell of soil mixing with the salt of his skin. He stayed until the sun dipped behind the rooftops, until the shadows swallowed the graves, until his eyes closed not from exhaustion but peace. When he returned to the store that night, everything looked the same, but everything felt different. He washed his hands, turned on the backlight, and reopened the drawer where the letter lay. He read it again, this time without guilt. And as he looked at the last sentence once more, he whispered aloud, not a prayer, not a goodbye, but a promise. A promise to remember. A promise to begin again. In the days that followed Tobias's burial, something shifted inside Luis that neither time nor routine could undo. He returned to the grocery store and reopened it quietly, no fanfare, no announcement. The regulars noticed the change immediately, not in the inventory or the prices, but in Luis himself. The man who once moved quickly, counting coins and stocking shelves with military precision, now paused more often, looked customers in the eye longer, and offered brief, almost imperceptible nods of recognition. He hadn't told anyone the story. He hadn't mentioned the dog or the letter or the grave beneath the chapel tree. But the gravity in his presence betrayed that something profound had passed through him, leaving behind a new kind of stillness, not the emptiness of loss, but the calm of understanding. Luis began closing the store an hour earlier than usual, not because business was slower, but because he had begun walking. Each evening, just before dusk, he left the iron gate drawn halfway and stepped outside with quiet purpose. Sometimes his steps took him down the alley behind the bakery, where children played with sticks and plastic balls. Other times he wandered toward the riverbank where old men sat on crates with fishing lines in the water, and no real hope of a catch. But he always ended his walk the same way, at the small cemetery behind the chapel, where the crate marked Tobias stood beneath the tree that had already begun shedding leaves in the wind. He never stayed long. Sometimes he didn't even sit. He simply looked, his hands in his pockets, his eyes tracing the shape of the mound, and then he turned back, carrying the silence with him like a borrowed coat. The letter remained in the drawer beneath the counter. Luis had read it so many times that he no longer needed to unfold it to recall every word. The phrases echoed in his mind at unexpected moments, when slicing fruit, when organizing change, when watching a mother calm her crying child in the cereal aisle. This dog knows the smell of grief. The sentence struck him hardest. It suggested something more than instinct, more than coincidence. It meant Tobias hadn't just wandered the city by chance. He had come with intention, with memory, with purpose woven into every faltering step. Luis found himself wondering how far the dog had traveled. Had he come across neighborhoods, towns, train tracks, rivers? How many doors had he passed? How many nights had he slept cold before finding this one store, this one sidewalk, where the final part of his duty could be fulfilled? And why had she, the woman Luis had once loved with the fervor of youth, chosen a dog to deliver her final words? He thought of writing a reply, of placing it in a tin and burying it beside the dog, but the idea felt strange, performative. In truth, the message had been one-sided by design. She hadn't expected or needed a response. She had left him the dog not to reopen something, but to allow it to rest. A week later, something unexpected happened. A woman stepped into the store with a slow gait and a hesitant voice. She was in her 60s, with gray curls tucked into a faded scarf and a brown coat too heavy for the weather. She asked for oranges and cheese, and as Luis moved to gather the items, she mentioned that she had once known a woman named Clara who used to speak often of a man with kind eyes and stubborn silence. Luis froze. He placed the oranges on the counter without looking up. The woman smiled softly and added, "She never stopped loving you, you know. She just didn't know how to wait forever." He didn't respond. He simply nodded and placed the cheese in the bag, but inside him, the walls cracked again, letting in something he hadn't let touch him for years. The woman said no more. She paid with exact change, thanked him, and stepped outside. He watched her leave, her steps careful but steady, and wondered how many others had heard pieces of the story he thought he had buried. How many had seen Clara in her final years? How many had known Tobias as more than just an old stray? That evening, Luis didn't close the store early. Instead, he left the door open as the sun dipped below the rooftops and waited behind the counter in silence. A boy came in with torn shoes and asked for a loaf of bread. Luis gave it to him and waved off the coins he offered. A woman asked if he could hold her shopping while she ran home for her wallet, and he agreed without hesitation. The city hadn't changed, but he had. The echoes of a dying dog's breath still lived in the quiet moments between transactions, in the corners of his thoughts, in the way his hands lingered when passing items over the counter. Before closing, he walked once more to the back room and opened the drawer with the letter. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to. He simply rested his hand over the folded paper, now softened by the weeks, and whispered something only he could hear. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't even a memory. It was a promise, not to forget, not to drown again in the silence he had carried for so long. He turned off the lights and stepped outside. The stars were visible tonight, clearer than usual, and the air carried the scent of oranges and dust. He stood on the sidewalk where Tobias had collapsed, where everything had begun again. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he walked away, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the calm certainty of a man who had finally understood what it meant to be found, not by someone, but by something far greater. Weeks turned into months, and although the streets remained the same, the cracked pavement, the rusted signs, the faded posters fluttering against the lampposts, something within Luis had evolved in a way that only grief and redemption could sculpt. He continued running the store with the same steadiness, but beneath each motion, every shelf restocked and coin counted, there was an underlying current of deeper attention, of presence that had once been absent. The story of the old dog who had collapsed outside his door never spread widely. It wasn't written in newspapers, nor spoken of in hushed tones between neighbors. But those who frequented the store began to notice a shift, not in Luis's words, which remained few, but in his gestures. They became softer, more deliberate, as if each customer reminded him of something he was afraid to forget. One late afternoon, as the season began its slow crawl toward winter, a child entered the store with wide eyes and ragged sleeves. He hovered near the counter, not asking for anything, just watching Luis with the quiet curiosity of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Luis stepped out from behind the counter and crouched to meet him eye level. Without a word, he took a loaf of bread from the shelf and wrapped it in paper. The boy's fingers trembled when he reached for it, as though unused to receiving without giving. Luis smiled faintly and returned to his place behind the register, the moment needing no transaction, no acknowledgement. It was enough. The silence between them said everything. Later that night, long after he had closed the metal shutters and turned off the neon light, Luis sat alone in the back room, the letter still folded in the drawer beside him. He hadn't reread it in weeks, yet its words remained etched into his memory like a scar that didn't hurt but also never faded. Clara's voice lived between those lines, not the voice he had remembered from youth, but the one she had become in her final years, wiser, wounded, and somehow more whole. Tobias had been her messenger, but also her mirror, and now Louise understood. The dog hadn't just delivered her words. He had absorbed her final will, her last ounce of faith in the man who had once been too afraid to reach back. And in the moment of his collapse, Tobias had passed that burden, that gift, into Louise's hands. That weekend, Louise did something he hadn't done in nearly 20 years. He locked the store early and boarded a bus out of town. The road wound through hills and fields and towns whose names he barely remembered, but the route felt familiar. When he finally arrived at the edge of a small village, the sky had turned a deep gray, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. He walked slowly, uncertain of what he was searching for, until he reached a modest house with a low fence and a yard overgrown with dry grass. A woman in her 50s stood by the porch, arms folded across a wool sweater, eyes narrowing as he approached. He introduced himself simply, said his name and nothing more. Her expression didn't soften, but her eyes did. She nodded once and stepped aside, letting him into the home Clara had once lived in. The woman, Clara's younger sister, brought out a small tin box from a cabinet and placed it on the table between them. Inside were photographs, a few dried flowers, a worn collar, and a folded newspaper clipping yellowed with age. Louise didn't speak. He simply reached for the collar, traced its frayed edges, and let his breath settle into something heavy and calm. The sister spoke only once, telling him Clara had never stopped writing, even when the letters were returned unopened. She had kept everyone, even those Louise never saw. In the end, when her illness grew worse, she'd entrusted Tobias with one final message, believing, foolishly or faithfully, that he would find the right moment, the right place. Louise left the house with the tin box tucked beneath his arm and took the last bus back into the city. That night, he placed the collar beside the folded letter in the drawer and sat quietly, the light above him flickering as the wind pressed against the windows. In his mind, he retraced every moment, the collapse of the dog, the trembling breath, the silence that followed. It no longer haunted him. It humbled him. It reminded him that sometimes love doesn't arrive in time to heal, but it comes anyway, to witness the ache and offer a final truth before the door closes forever. Over the coming months, Louise became a quiet guardian to the neighborhood. He offered bread to the children whose parents came home too late. He repaired old locks for elderly customers who couldn't afford a locksmith. He started keeping a water bowl outside the store, not for any one dog in particular, but as a gesture, a memory carved into habit. People didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. They only knew that the man who owned the store had once been different, harder, quieter in a way that made the air colder. Now, there was something warmer in his stillness. Something open. Years later, a mural was painted on the brick wall beside the store. It showed an old dog resting peacefully beneath a tree, with a folded letter resting beneath his paw. Above the dog, a figure stood not with arms outstretched or weeping, but simply watching, one hand over his chest. No name was signed beneath it. No explanation offered. But those who passed it slowed their steps, even if only for a moment, feeling that somewhere in the lines of paint and shadow, something real had happened, something worth remembering. Louise never sought recognition. He never told the full story. But each night, before he turned the key to lock the door, he would glance at the mural, then down at the sidewalk where Tobias had collapsed. And in that pause, brief as a heartbeat, he whispered the same silent words he had once spoken in the back room, words only he and a dying dog would ever understand. And then, as always, he walked into the quiet evening, carrying memory not as a weight, but as a light.